Morning, guys. It is Tuesday, April 7th. We haven't had a YouTube lesson in a couple of days, so I am on page 380. That's where we're going to start. We're still talking about civil rights. If you've noticed, this chapter is really long. There's almost 50 pages in this chapter, I think. And a lot of these points are really driven home of what's going on in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, actually. One of the last things that we talked about, something that you should really know, it's something that you should remember, was President Kennedy's assassination. And we talked about that a little bit the other day. He was shot in Dallas, Texas by Lee Harvey Oswald. And they were never able to question Lee Harvey Oswald as to the reason of why he shot or assassinated President Kennedy, because he was assassinated about 4 days later. And so that was one of the last things that we talked about, and I did want to mention that again. Just very important that you know that. So he was the fourth president to be assassinated. So we're going through the civil rights. On page 381, we see Lyndon Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into effect with Dr. Martin Luther King there. If we go over to page 382, on 382, there's really one person that I want you to know about on this page. He was North Carolina's most famous civil rights attorney. He was a great lawyer. His name was Julius Chambers, and he fought discrimination by working to change laws. So he did a lot for the African Americans in North Carolina and in the South, for that matter. Just fought really hard, and it says that courts often ruled that employers needed to make up for past discrimination by adopting affirmative action policies that set aside a certain number of jobs for African Americans. So we're right again in the height of the civil rights movement. If we turn to page 384, if you look on page 384, we're going to talk about war on poverty for a moment. If you see the picture of this woman holding the baby, I think this is an Appalachian woman. When you guys get, or if you've ever been in Coach Saul's room in the high school, he has got, I think there's a black and white photo of this, or another woman that's very similar that just is indicative of this time period. And at this time in North Carolina in the 60s, the state's wages were the lowest in the nation. Poverty was widespread, and 1/4 of adults had less than a 6th grade education. Some areas that there was a lot of poverty also was in the western part of the state, in the Appalachian Mountains. It's just, the poverty there was just, it was far reaching. It was all over the state. Poverty was also common in North Carolina's eastern counties. Foreign jobs started to disappear because there were tractors and there were different types of machines, such as cotton pickers, that had replaced manpower. So a lot of people had to move from the country into the city, and not all of them were able to find work when they got there because obviously they were uneducated in that regard. Turn to page 386, the North Carolina Fund. I wanted to talk about the North Carolina Fund for a moment. It said it was the first program of its kind in the United States. It was designed to, quote, enable the poor to become productive, self-reliant citizens. And this fund was started with young people. It chose 100 college students, black and white, men and women, to spend a summer working in some of the state's poorest communities. The students, who were called North Carolina Volunteers, tutored children, ran recreational programs, and worked with the public health nurses. They helped renovate houses, and they performed a lot of services to try to help the poverty-stricken people of North Carolina, and the children especially. There's a great picture on 386. If you can see, this young woman has come in and she's teaching this lady how to run a sewing machine, it looks like. And so it was a good thing, a lot like Miss Moy and Miss Lewis's SERVE program, perhaps, just helping the community. If we move on to page 388, by this time, Lyndon Johnson, he's actually a Texan. He takes over. He was the vice president for JFK, and he will be the president. And yesterday, I had you do an assignment, and you had to, I haven't even looked to read them. It'll be for a grade, but just your synopsis of the Vietnam War. And it really was never a war. You could check me, I might be wrong, but I don't think Congress ever declared war on Vietnam. It was more of a conflict. And my father, he fought in Vietnam. A lot of your grandfathers probably were in Vietnam. You could probably ask them about it, and they would be able to tell you some things about it. some of you might have asked a grandparent or whatever yesterday what Vietnam was about. That would have been a good idea. But I do want you to know the who, the what, the when, the where of Vietnam. That'll be something that you'll learn about in US, not US, but AP World or whatever world history that you take, and probably US too. But communist North Korea invaded non-communist South Korea, and as you are aware, we've just gone through World War II and the Korean War, and there's just an urgency to stop the spread of communism. And despite, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, the people of North Carolina, they did not, or not of North Carolina, many people in the country, they didn't support Lyndon Johnson's involvement in the war. And a lot of American soldiers died, and we felt like that they had died for nothing. The North Vietnamese Army, known as the Viet Cong, were well-trained, determined, and difficult to attack. It fought using a tactic called guerrilla warfare. Small groups of soldiers hid in the jungle or in scattered villages and ambushed American troops. American soldiers were not used to this type of fighting, and they made little headway in the early years of the war. I know that most every one of you've heard me mention it, have probably seen the movie Forrest Gump. Well, Forrest Gump is a great movie that talks about and carries you through the entire Vietnamese conflict. So that would be a great movie to watch. It's a family movie too, classic, that would help you understand about Vietnam. A couple of other things about the war in Vietnam. The soldiers got back, and if you look on page 389, you can see these are soldiers. It says students from North Carolina State University and the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill marched at the state capitol to protest the war. And sadly enough, a lot of people that came back from Vietnam, the soldiers that were there just performing their duty as American citizens because they were drafted. There was a huge draft. They were treated very badly just because there was just such a group of people that thought that they should not have been there. There was the talk about, they were killing innocent villagers and babies, and this was one of a war that the media really got involved in, and they were on the front line. So there were all kind of pictures and graphics from this war, and it just upset Americans. And it says in 1962, 52 Americans died in Vietnam, but in 1967, 11,153 people died. And again, reporters began to travel to the conflict and send gruesome pictures of death and devastation. So this just sort of, like the media has done to some extent with COVID-19, sometimes things just get sensationalized, and it just creates a lot of panic and havoc. By 1967, Vietnam was at the center of American politics. Civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. called on President Johnson to end the war. And really what happened was this conflict is just it's gonna be over, but we don't feel like the United States, I don't know that we feel like we really ever, a lot of people don't feel like we really ever accomplished anything. So just make sure that you've read 388 and 389. I'm anxious to read your take on the Vietnam War, and just make sure that you have an understanding of it. So anyway, I think that'll be a pretty good place to stop for today. Be with you again probably on Thursday, and we'll talk a little bit more about the war, and we'll talk about the Green Berets, just several other points of interest that we're going to hit on. The Black Panthers, we're going to talk about Woodstock. There's several little things that we're going to talk about that you would have remembered before. So anyway, I hope you guys are all staying safe, and there's Grace again, and you want to say hey, Garrett? There's Garrett. We'll see you guys later. I hope all of you are staying safe. Take care. Bye.